Morning or good evening, everyone. My name is Milos Sokolic, and I'm here with Christina Newhart. We're both docents here at the Letterform Archive. I use he, him pronouns, and Christina, please,
She,
quick
her.
intro. So while we hold a bit of time of grace for those folks who might be running a bit late, we'll just give you a quick introduction to who we are, where we came from, and then some ways for you to learn more or be involved with the archive. So welcome to Letterform Archive. And despite the name, we are more than just an archive, and we hold more than just letter forms. At our core, we are a independent special collections library that houses the history of communication, and we specialize in written forms from all eras all across the world. We were founded in 2015, starting out as the private collection of Rob Saunders, with the unique mission of collecting and sharing letter forms. And this prompted many other collectors and designers to also donate to the Letterform Archive. Some notable examples include the Tolinar collection, which accounts for much of our type specimens, Dennis Ichiyama's collection of branding manuals, and the entire archive of Emigre magazine, which was donated to us on the condition that the magazine become fully accessible to the public, digitally and for free. And this is just one of the many, many resources that you can find on the online archive. It is how we give online tours, how we're giving this tour today. It's an excellent resource for research and just top-notch phone scrolling. So we are a bit unique for three reasons. First, we collect letter forms. Second, we are not attached to any larger organization like a university, for example. And third, we have a policy of radical access. And Christina will tell you a bit more about that.
And so you might be wondering, what does radical access mean? It means we share the collection more openly than similar institutions. Some examples: we give free research visits to anyone. You don't need to be a student or a designer. In these visits, you can request to see almost anything in the collection and touch it with your bare hands. It is actually safer for the materials we find because your fingertips are an important source of information. So we just ask people to wash their hands on the tours, and it can tell you how far a book wants to open, what it's made of. We are also dedicated to digital access, and we are proud sponsors of the People's Graphic Design Archive. We are also more than just an archive. We have an education program called Type West that offers public workshops, a certificate in type design. We are also a publisher. We have a publishing wing creating beautiful books about works in the collection with commissioned essays, as well as facsimiles of some rare materials that would otherwise be lost to the contemporary world. We have an incredible editorial staff dedicated to creating free resources about our holdings across the internet. Through our blog, newsletter, social media platforms, you can learn more about the work. We, in San Francisco, we have a jewel box gallery space. We highly encourage you to come visit. The 10 by 10 by 10 show is up right now, which is very cool. And those host externally curated exhibitions, which also make learning the stories of the archive even more accessible. We also have a curatorial team striving to make the collection more representative of world populations and writing systems. We have a vast program of lectures throughout the year. Archive of them are on Vimeo, with some of the greats of design history, such as Emory Douglas, the Minister of Culture for the Black Panthers. We also have a membership program, which helps keep our doors open and includes some exciting perks. We'll drop a link to that at the end. And finally, we have the docent program that Milos and I are part of, funded by the Hauser and Wirth Foundation, which enables our tours. So I believe by now we should have everyone who's going to make it today, and we'll start with a little background on the genre that Milos will share, and we will be dropping links at the end of the talk, as I mentioned. Also, if you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A, and Anna will be pulling them out at the end.
So, Christina, can you just confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes.
Can't see you if you're pointing, sorry. All right, then let's start. So today we'll be talking about concrete poetry, and we wanted to start with a bit of an introduction. So as a term, concrete poetry is fairly modern. It emerged as a genre sometime in the first half of the 20th century. But we can see examples of typographic composition being used as kind of an integral part of poetry going back millennia. So one of the earliest examples is this poem, which is Wings by Simmias of Rhodes. And this was created sometimes before 300 BC. We're not exactly sure. This is actually from a reprint from 1640. And as we can see, the lines of text in ancient Greek are arranged to create the image of wings. Another example is this image from the Aratea, which is a compilation of astronomic texts, which was created by Marcus Tullius Cicero, and this was also in the BC, a bit later than Simmias of Rhodes. But here, for example, we can see that the text kind of forms the body of the rabbit. We've got some illustration to help us kind of put the pieces together, and we can also see the constellation that the stars actually make up the constellation. Then we can also find calligrams, which is text shaped to kind of form a thematically coherent image. And we can find these across cultures and across eras and scripts. So we've got two examples. One is a Shahid calligraphy in the form of a tiger. And then the other is shaped text in the form of a serpent. And this is in a Georgian script. Then we've also got examples in the Renaissance. Well, these appeared sometime in the Renaissance, and these are Carmen Figuratum poems, where the words of the poem are used to form some shape or pattern. And these usually had to do something with sacred images or patterns. Or we would have, for example, red letters on a black field that kind of stood out and created this image. And the idea was that as the reader read the text, they would also meditate on the image they could see. This is an example from the Veneration of the Cross by Rabanus Maurus, which is sometime in the 9th century. And then this is a later example of a shaped poem, let's say. I wouldn't say concrete poetry just yet. This is the poem Zdravljica by France Prešeren, who is a Slovene poet. And here we can see that each stanza kind of creates this shape of a goblet. Zdravljica actually means a toast. And it's quite interesting that this, after a while, this poem was actually put to music and then adapted into today's Slovene national anthem. Like all artists, concrete poets were influenced by the social and political context in which they lived, but also their personal lives, loss, major wars, social movements. Some turned to concrete poetry as a way to push against existing norms. Others saw it as a means of artistic experimentation. And through today's tour, we'll give you glimpses into this very rich art form, starting with some of the, let's say, very first examples, which we could call concrete poetry, from Mallarmé and Apollinaire, all the way to today. Just one note before we start is that there are many terms for this form of shaped text. It could be shaped text, visual poetry, concrete poetry, and they all mean different things. We will use visual and concrete poetry interchangeably here, and it's a long debate whether they are or not the same thing, but this is just a heads up, and if you have opinions on that, we'd love to hear them. Finally, before starting, we would just invite you to think of these two questions while looking at the objects today. The first is, where do you notice shifts from the literal to the visual in creating meaning? And the second is, do these poems change how you define language? Now I'll hand it over to Christina to start us off with the very first object.
Thank you, Milos. So we're going to begin with one of my favorite pieces that it's very emotional, I think. This piece is called A Throw of the Dice Will Never Abolish Chance, Un coup de dé jamais n'abolira l'assaut, by Stéphane Mallarmé. This was created in, well, we have a couple versions. So the work we're looking at was made in 1914, and we'll jump and look at some sketches from or an earlier printing of it from 1897. Stéphane Mallarmé was a French symbolist poet whose work would impact major art movements of the 20th century, such as Futurism, Dadaism, and Surrealism. This piece we're looking at, Un coup de dé, this was his magnum opus. It is a giant leap from his previous traditional poetry, which was left aligned and locked on the usual grid you would imagine poetry is locked on. It leaps to this new experimental visual language, creating meaning beyond the literal. It gives a semantic value to white space. And this just hadn't been seen before. This piece is hugely influential. There have been books written about this work. There have been artists making work in response to this piece. It's been the source of other work for decades. So it was first published in a magazine, Cosmopolis, in 1897. So Miloš, would you jump over to the other screen and we'll show. We have a couple pieces of Mallarmé's commentary on this piece. He was really unhappy with this very first printing, and I can't unfortunately interpret the handwriting as to what his notes were, but I think on the right you can see for a writer, he has a lot of opinions about type design here and layout, so you can see he's taking issue with some of the alignments. So it's very unusual at this time. This kind of using of space just had not really been done. Can we go back to the OA? Thanks, Miloš. The other interesting thing about the piece we're looking at is that it's a posthumous work. This was published 16 years after Mallarmé's death. And it was incorporated some of his comments from the first printing. So much of Mallarmé's poetry in his life was about grief. He personally experienced a lot of personal loss in his life. He lost both of his parents and his sister by the time he was age 21. He lost one of his children at a young age, at age 7. And I feel like that infuses the meaning of this work. The poem is about a shipwreck, and I feel like there is this wreckage of type across the spreads. The narrator of the poem is a captain, and he is swimming through the debris of the boat, and he is holding a pair of dice above his head, and he's looking for a surface to cast that dice on. And it's to divine the future amid catastrophe. And you can you feel that emotion and narrative and the fluidity of the movement of the type, the way it's jumping in the gutter, the wreckage of scattered words, the tension and discontinuity. Grammatically, it is also, the placement of some of these words also are not what you would expect. It holds elements of later Dadaism and its qualities of chance. The die is a reference to chance and randomness. The piece is also about semantics, the relationship between sign and symbol. He spent his life searching for a new aesthetics, and in this piece, he is not just separating the meaning from literal text, he is assigning value to white space, and that was a very radical new concept for Western visual communication at that time. And we'll be sharing a link to a piece by Marcel Brutars later, which has the same name, Coup de Dé. And he takes that concept even further and strips out the words themselves into shapes. So with that, we are going to jump to another work by another French symbolist poet who was contemporary with Mallarmé, and we'll hand it to Miloš.
Thanks, Christina. So we are still staying in France. And we're looking at an object where we can already see some examples of what will become concrete poetry. It is actually a work called Calligrams, Poems of Peace and War. And it was created by Guillaume Apollinaire, who is a French poet, playwright, art critic. He is notable as one of the forefathers of surrealism, having created one of the very first surrealist works, The Breasts of Tiresias. And in his art, some of the kind of guiding principles are intuition, imagination, and as we'll see in the spreads, experimentation. He was actually starting out quite influenced by symbolist poets. This is a collection of poems, and as the title suggests, many of these poems deal with his experience, his wartime experiences, both as a artilleryman and infantry officer. We can actually see his portrait on the left page. He, during the war, was wounded in the head by shrapnel in 1916, and in 1918, because this weakened him, was one of the victims of the Spanish influenza pandemic. Now, this is also his work was also published after his death in 1918. And Calligrams as a book explores how typefaces, letter forms, their arrangement on the page can actually play just as an important part in creating the meaning of the poems as much as the text itself. He actually had quite an interesting take on this book, and I'm quoting this. He said that it is an idealization of free verse poetry and typographical precision in an era when typography is reaching a brilliant end to its career, at the dawn of the new means of reproduction that are the cinema and the phonograph. Now, personally, I'm quite happy that he wasn't entirely correct. But we can see in his thinking about the book that he was thinking about how to push typography forward and what would be the new ways of using it, the new ways of expression. The first poem that we're looking at here is called The Necktie and the Watch, and this is a poem that is kind of a commentary on the contemporary hierarchical structures and how society limits people in some ways. And he uses the words of the poems to create an image of a necktie and an image of a pocket watch. And for example, in the necktie, he calls it painful necktie, which civilizes men. And then in the watch poem, he comments on how busy contemporary men are, people are, how quickly life passes. And we can kind of see this in the way that the words are arranged, and we can almost hear the clock ticking while reading the poem. Here, for example, he uses quite a few devices to create a very playful and dynamic composition. First of all, we have to actually turn the book to read the poem, and then we can see that he uses different typefaces. He uses the typefaces, different font sizes, arranges them in different ways to kind of create this added layer of meaning. Here, for example, we've got a very normal layout for a poem, but then just this little bit is arranged almost as like the smoke coming out of the cigarette, and it is exactly what this line says. It says, "And I smoke tobacco from around there or from the area." And this is a poem on his wartime experiences, but we can see the words kind of forming this pattern and adding that layer of meaning. And this is one of my favorite spreads here, especially this part. He talks about a starry night illuminated by the moon, and the way the letters are arranged on the page, we can almost see this starry sky that he's talking about. Here, for example, he plays with kind of the layout of the lines, creates this sunburst pattern, which is again quite unusual, and I wanted to show it because we'll be seeing this quite a lot in the next objects. Now, Calligrams is one of the earliest printed examples of concrete poetry, and similarly to the previous work and a couple of next objects that we'll be looking at, remains very influential both as a textual publication and as an art object. Now we're going a couple of years in the future, 1923, in Russia. And before I talk about this object, I have to say that this is one of the most popular objects in the archive. I don't know a person that doesn't really love this object, so much so that I think we have a couple of facsimiles because the original just can't handle all the love. But this is For the Voice. This is a book of poems, 13 poems by Vladimir Mayakovsky, who was a prominent futurist poet in Russia. And this book was constructed, as you can read here, not designed, by L. Lisitsky. He considered himself a constructor. And he's also another influential Russian avant-garde figure from the early 20th century. He was actually mentored by Malevich, who is, again, prominent Russian artist, kind of started suprematism, influenced a lot of movements in art, constructivism, Bauhaus movement, and we can see a lot of these influences throughout the book. The book was actually published in Berlin, and it is printed in two colors, in black and in a very vibrant red. And it is interesting just as an object itself. It's actually considered one of his finest bookmaking works. One of my favorite bits is that on the right-hand side, there is this index, which makes it very easy to find the specific poem that we're looking for in the book. And for each of the poems, we've got the title of the poem and then a little icon representing it. And we can see that throughout very basic geometric shapes are used, and these are all very basic principles of spermatism. The idea is that you use basic shapes to express deeper concepts or notions, and this is obviously reducing it in a very simple way. But it also makes the book quite accessible. The idea was that anyone could understand it even just through the images. Another interesting bit is that he doesn't use just letters, he uses punctuation marks and also spacers to actually create these typographical compositions. Before each poem, we have kind of a composition of type that represents it. And these poems were actually meant to be read aloud. For example, this one, To March, or Our March, the way the letters are arranged here, we can almost kind of feel this marching, walking dynamic. And this poem specifically invites people to go on a march, to raise their voices, and the red square here represents the squares where these protests or marches happened. The red obviously then insinuating blood, which kind of followed. On this layout, on this page, we can see these very blocky letters, the consonants, and then the vowels are much smaller, creating these 4 words. And again, it's kind of this invitation to go to march. Here, it's supposed to mimic, I think, the noise, the sound that horses' hooves make. And we can, again, just looking at this and then reading it, grib, grab, grob, grub, it kind of has that quality to it, just expressed in a very visual way. Again, we see this idea of playing with direction, of playing with the size of the type. Colors are used to emphasize certain bits of the text. And this also reflects, as some of the next works, the kind of ideas that L. Lissitzky was trying to maybe express, because this also is a step away from all the traditional publishing done until then, the traditional way in which poetry is represented, in which people need to engage with poetry, and it kind of represents new ideals and new ideas and rebels against what was there before. As an object, it's quite interesting, even considering it on its own, but it can also be situated in this larger conversation around visual language, because it's a almost announcement of what is to come. And we'll be looking now at another piece that has these, that also promotes these new ideas and rebels against what was before, but in somewhat different way. And Christina will tell you a bit more about that.
Thank you, Milos. We are now going to jump to Italy. This piece was made in 1932, and it is the work of Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. This is Parole in Libertà Futuriste, but it's also known as the Tin Book locally. Marinetti was one of the driving forces behind Italian futurism, and the book that we're looking at today is a great embodiment of some of the core tenets of this movement. It is constructed from tin, so this reflects the futurist fascination with the machine, which was a symbol of speed and dynamism in the modern age. It embodies interest in multisensory experience. It was read out loud, it was performed. Turning the pages makes noise, so it's meant to be, it has an oral quality to it. The spine is a reference to a flute, so there's a sense of musicality. And the book was a collaboration between Marinetti, Dal Bosilla, who was a futurist sculptor and ceramicist who designed the page layouts, and Lito Latta was the printer. They are a factory in Savona that produced sheet metal products, so this was not the typical piece that they would make. Apart from the very impressive materiality of this book, the layouts are quite experimental. There is an exuberance of energy, noise, and movement. And here we have a picture of Marinetti opening the book. The type bursts through the pages. It disregards any sense of a grid. It's almost shouting in conversation, many voices at once. The thick and condensed sans serif fonts, they are indelicate. They carry weight. They are modern and use a lot of shifting font sizes. I particularly love, I think it's the next page, Milos. Yeah, I particularly love this spread, the way that it's embodying the yes, no, see, no, see, no, see, and is at a diagonal slant. It has a conversational energy to it, and I love the color scheme of this piece, this spread. It is important to note, though, in looking at this piece, which I do find really aesthetic and beautiful in a lot of ways, despite the inventiveness of Marinetti's work and its aesthetic quality, Marinetti was also the co-author of the Fascist Manifesto, which was adopted by Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was first prime minister and the dictator of Italy from 1922 to 1943, and it's interesting that much of what makes the Tin Book so compelling, this interest in modernity and dynamism, breaking with tradition, those were also core driving ideals of fascism, which sought to aggressively break with the past in search of utopian futures. There is this quality of creative destruction to the movement, of breaking in order to build, of leaving the past behind. You might think, does move fast and break things sound familiar to us today? Some lines from the Futurist Manifesto: we intend to sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and fearlessness. It sounds romantic until one considers how that attitude expressed itself in such actions as Marinetti's aerial bombing of Tunisia, or as an aggression that was cheered by Marinetti and the Futurists, by Italy's aerial bombing of Tunisia, aggression that was cheered by Marinetti and the Futurists for its innovative use of dirigibles and planes to attack another country from the air. So that was a technical innovation, but it was a violence and an aggression. Well, another interesting thing about Marinetti is he is an early example of an artist being their own brand. And I'm quoting here from John Mann at Artsy. Marinetti's public braggadocio, his manipulation of and engagement with the mass media, changed the way artists conceived of their relationship to the art world and popular culture. So I think that's very interesting that we see the start of the artist being their own brand here with Marinetti's work. So he's very influential. And it's, of course, funny that he has this picture of himself at the beginning. I think this is a reminder to think critically about art that advocates for social change. Is it always good? What kind of social change? What is the context? And it's important to consider the social political context of their time. So now we will jump to 1970s Argentina. We are going to examine a really beautiful and interesting work of asemic writing. And this also was made under a time of political repression, but with very different artistic intention than the Tin Book. And I'll pass it to Milos.
Thanks, Christina. So this is Diario Numero Uno, Año Uno, which was created by Mirta Drmisaje. This is actually reproduced from her original handmade work. Mirta Drmisaje was kind of an outsider in the Latin American contemporary art mainstream and the Buenos Aires art scene. She didn't have that much of an exposure there. Took place in a couple of group exhibitions throughout her life, and related more to the European linguists, artists, and editors like Guy Schreinen, who actually served as publisher for this edition. In general, her work focused on languages and how media formats influence our perception of content messages. She explored asemic scripts, which are a graphism that looks like writing but doesn't really mean anything. And then her attention also dug into time and space and rhythm as significant components of writing systems. And her works are actually quite interesting just for page layout artists, type designers, because they show us actually how coherence in a piece of work actually influences the perception that we have of it. Now, what we're looking at here was created during the military dictatorship in Argentina by General Lanús, which was from 1971 until 1973. So, as with any dictatorship, there were human rights violations, illegalization of opposing political parties, left-wing guerrilla activities, free speech suppression, so much so that media couldn't really write about anything. And this was actually Greta's response to that. What we see before us very obviously reads as a newspaper, and it does so because of all of the things I mentioned just now. She uses layout that is very familiar to us, something that we're very used to, a convention. We can see the bold asemic graphics, let's call them, not type, which mimics a headline. We can see subheadings and then columns of body text. And despite not having any meaning, we know what we're looking at. And I find this quite clever and interesting because they couldn't really say anything. So she decided not to through these words, through this work. And in that, she said quite a lot about the situation without any semantic meaning behind these graphisms. I'll just zoom in so that we can take a look and keep in mind this was all done by hand and then later on reproduced. And we see how, she laid this out, how she used the thickness of the lines, the size to mimic what we know of a newspaper, a little quote here. And this just happens throughout the whole piece. I'll zoom in to take a look at the different bits. She also mixes different examples of asemic writing. She actually built a whole art practice around this. And without using a single word, she very clearly expresses what she wants to. The meaning is almost tangible in this case. And this bit I really like because just looking at it, to me at least, it looks like birds in flight or a sequence of a bird in flight. But it leaves it quite open to interpretation. And this is an interesting way of how and this isn't specifically concrete poetry, but how visual language, let's say, can help us express quite a lot. In the last page, we see some overlay happening, and it's just a very interesting piece of work because it plays a lot with meaning beyond the semantic, which is one of the kind of key notions behind concrete poetry. So we thought it's quite interesting to see it, especially because it's also situated in a very specific political context. Speaking of which, we will be going all the way across the continent at around the same time, well, all across the world, sorry, at around the same time, and looking at a very interesting piece of concrete poetry. Christina?
Thank you. We are going to now look at work by a really influential figure in Indian typography. This is the work of R.K. Joshi. He was a calligrapher, typographer, designer, and poet. He was pivotally important to the typographic development of Indian scripts and was described by the scholar Anjali Nurlikar as the real concretist in Marathi poetry. And this is an example of that we're looking at today. This piece came out of the little magazine movement of the 1960s when Maharashtra was becoming a state. So this piece also reflects this the social political driving changes in language and focusing on language that we see in other work, but maybe from a more artistic perspective. The state formation is significant to what we're talking about today because it was being driven by the need for linguistic representation. There was a demand for Marathi speakers to create the state to protect their language and cultural identity. The little magazine movement allowed small publishers to express their joys and frustration in short-run publications like this, which is Rava Magazine, issue number 10. These were made cheaply and printed on low-grade paper. They were very inexpensive to purchase. The movement also highlighted artists and writers' voices who were active in the very newly formed Dalit Panther Party, which had risen out of social political events in the formation of Maharashtra state. As you can imagine, they were drawing inspiration from the Black Panther Party and African American literature and forming the Dalit Panthers. And the Dalits or Untouchables were pushing back against the structures of discrimination and caste in their work. So this magazine, Rava, was published at a seminal moment. It was just a few months after the Dalit Panthers were formed. Dalit Panther Party was formed. Jyoti edited and designed this 10th edition, and it's filled with his concrete poetry. It is in Marathi and set in the Devanagari script, and it sold for 1/5 of a rupee, so highly accessible and for the people. If we could go back to the cover, Milosh. The cover text is broken into 2 syllables, Rava, right? And he repeats them in the corners. You can see the top right and the bottom left have the same syllable, and also top left and bottom right. The poetry within visualizes the words square, circle, and dot. So here you can see on the left, it's embodying what it says, square. On the right is circle. And as we move further into it, we start to move into concepts. So there's linear, which is a little bit descriptive, and dot. But on the next page, we have more abstract concept like play. So the text is embodying a concept, or behavior on the right. These are really simply elegant, I think. They have an accessibility and also a playfulness that I find very beautiful. And I'm going to share a quote from Joshi, which I love. If a poem follows an inbuilt pattern of rhythm, and its content is drenched in visual imagery, then these virtues should be transformed into a visual form that does not follow the routine. He's sort of saying, why not concrete poetry? Poetry is already visual and full of sense, so it's a very natural fit. So now we're going to look at a work that also shares a spirit of play, and we are jumping over to Brazil and looking at the work, collaborative work by 2 Brazilian artists.
So we're still keeping to the 70s, and we're looking at Poemobiles, which is a groundbreaking visual poetry collaboration between Augusto de Campos and Julio Plaza. Both of them were very significant figures in the Brazilian concrete poetry movement. This was published in 1974. It contains 13 poems, and it's not really a traditional book of poetry, but rather a series of experimental, interactive visual poems that explore the relationship between words, shapes, and movement. The title actually combines the words poem and mobiles, which really reflects the dynamic nature of the work, so much so that we will actually take a look at a video that one of the docents, Enrique, did in the archive to really do this piece justice. So it's not really a book of poems as much as it is 13 unbound single poems. So already there is this idea of interactivity because you can read them in any order that you like to. And interactivity plays a very important part in the whole concept of this work. So the poems are presented as these paper constructions or cutouts that require manipulation. And you'll see that in a bit. But as a reader, you don't just hold a book in your hand and read a poem from a page. You need to fold the poem, open them, close them, rotate them, open parts of the poems so that new words can be revealed, new meaning can be revealed. And it's really quite exciting looking at this piece in action. Now, as I mentioned, both Campos and Plaza were major contributors to the concrete poetry movement in Brazil and in general. And here they really focused not just on the visual, but also the spatial aspect of the text. In this work, in this object, words are treated not just as arrangements on a page, but rather arrangements in space as well, which contributes more to their meaning as much as the semantic content of each of the words. Now, another characteristic of general concrete poetry that we can see here is minimalism, or this restraint, in this case, both in the visual but also in the language itself. Not a lot of words are used in any of the poems. They're kept quite simple. And the same can be said for the design. Simple white paper, three primary colors, red, blue, yellow, which really leaves this interactive aspect of it to speak. And this is also a very interesting example because it is another collaboration. I mean, so far we've seen a couple, and it is just another in a long tradition of collaborations between poets and graphic designers or constructors. Because Augusto de Campos was a poet, and then Julio Plaza was an artist and graphic designer. And this is really a fusion of both visual and literary arts. It's also, much like the other works we saw so far, emphasizes the use of new media and forms in poetry, in a way anticipating digital poetry and other multimedia explorations. I'll just let the video play until the end because this is quite interesting. And it's really a piece that images don't do justice to, but comes alive in movement. Another interesting fact is that just like for the voice, there are 13 poems here. Not it means anything, but it's interesting that it repeats kind of like a fact. And thank you, Enrique, once more for the great video. Now, from Brazil, we are going some 20 years into the future, and to California, and we are looking at issue 21 of Emigre. Just a quick reminder, as I said, the entirety of the archive of Emigre magazine is actually available on the online archive. You can see these very high resolution scans, and it's an absolute treat. You can find examples of concrete poetry or shaped text in many of these issues, but we wanted to focus on this one because issue 21 is called New Faces, and it focused on the work of students at CalArts. This actually, in this issue, they had to work through three tasks or assignments. One was to define three words using image and text exclusively in combination, moving beyond the dictionary meaning of the word. They were supposed to do typographic interpretations of short stories by Italo Calvino, and then also do a bit of thinking and give their response to some contemporary issues or challenges in design. And a lot of the principles, devices, and ideas that we saw before are present here as well. We wanted to show this as an example that is not necessarily a poetry book. Just a bit of background for Emigre magazine. It was a quarterly publication, ran between 1984 and 2005, and it focused on communication design, typography, art criticism. And what they're very important for is that Emigre actually created some of the first digital layouts and typeface designs, and Emigre fonts originated from Emigre magazine. It was created by Rudy Vanderlans, who's the editor and art director, and Susanna Litzko, who was the type designer and typesetter. Now, we already went about what this issue did, and here we can see the word propaganda, kind of fitting with the overall theme of today's objects. But as we can see, the word is broken up by these lines of text in a sunburst pattern, and then we've got some words or phrases scattered around the page, all kind of defining the word propaganda through this visual metaphor as well. Because to me, this kind of looks like a megaphone or a loudspeaker. And then on the right-hand side, we can see the Scandian hooks falling into a box, which does associate towards propaganda, very interesting way. On this spread, we can see this is actually a reflection on literary structures and mechanisms, and the words and letters are arranged in ways that reflect the content of the text that is being discussed. On the left, we can see that we've got just letter forms doing this, and we can see some quite interesting examples of layout, like this one of rhythm. We can kind of see the rhythm of the layout itself. And then here we've got the same text, but in relation to an image, a metronome. And again, it plays very interestingly with how text is positioned, in this case, in interaction with the image, and how this creates another layer of meaning. So it's a very interesting kind of exploration of this idea that it's not just the words themselves that create the semantic meaning, but also how they're arranged on the page, how they interact with other elements, and what the white space says, basically. I really like how rhythm was done here as well with the bits of image. This last piece, we can see this arrangement around information and how it's defined relative to these images of little bits of screws. And it's, again, a very interesting interaction between how the text and the letters arrange the page and how the images contribute to this, but not just the image, also the way in which they're presented. And with this, we will be moving on to the present day and to the last two objects. Christina?
Thank you, Milos. We are now going to turn our attention to a book of a new genre we haven't seen yet, which is typewriter poetry. So this piece is called Weaving Patterns for Poetry. It is by the Lithuanian artist, poet, and researcher Gedija Chidikaitė. She composed this collection of poems first on a typewriter, and then with a two-color ribbon, and then it was mimeographed in a limited edition of 60 copies. So I just wanted to show you the cover first, and we'll take a look at the video so you get a sense of the movement within, and then we'll look at some images. It's really aesthetic and beautiful. I love the texture of this piece. I love words being used as fabric. So in this piece, Chidikaitė draws on the textural quality of Lithuanian bedspread patterns to explore parallels between weaving, writing, reading, and in her words, the often, very interesting way to describe it, the often bilingual shift between words and concepts. Like the other creators we've looked at, she's interested in the dualities and expansiveness of visual poetry, how it creates semantic meaning, both through visual language and literary meaning simultaneously. Her work explores the margins, the gaps, the peripheries, the space between and around ideas, between words and their concepts, between the verbal and the oral, between text and image, the gap between weaving and type. Where does one begin and one end? She is particularly fascinated by the role of metaphor in linguistic experience. As we know, traditionally weaving would happen during long winter evenings, and it will in some countries, accompanied by singing and storytelling. That's part of its folk history. And so this piece ties together the craft of textiles and the art of narration. Story would accompany weaving in the past. The creation of this book of poems, typewritten line by line, as one might weave on the loom, was meditation. And I really love how texture is working in this piece. Texture has been present in a lot of the work we've looked at, but this is a very different voice than the typographic textures of Mallarmé or Apollinaire or the student work in Émigré, for instance. And in a genre that's been historically male-dominated, I really appreciate how she connects typography and concrete poetry to this very often female world of textiles. And then we're going to close with an archive favorite. This is, again, a collaborative artist book from Korea, and it also beautifully embodies texture, but in 3 dimensions. So this piece is called Grass. It was printed by Dots Press. It was the text of this poem. It is a poem, and it was written by Kim Soo-young, who passed away well before this piece was created. The artist, the book designer, is Shan Louis, and this piece was created in 2019. So both weaving patterns and this work are more contemporary. It is made out of paper and wood, and it offers a unique perspective on contemporary Korean literature. It is just 12 pages, and it seamlessly weaves excerpts from Kim Soo-young's poem, Grass, which initially caught Shan Louis' attention during their time at Korean language school. This is also a limited edition work. Only 50 copies were printed in Korean and another 50 in English. We have a sample of each at the archive. So this is what we call a flagfold book. If you could scroll through, Milosh. And it is elaborately cut to simulate the texture of grass when opened. It's like similar to Poem Mobilis. The pictures don't really do it justice. When you open it up, it creates this cross-hatching and stands up almost like a sculpture. So it viscerally illustrates the standing up and the lying down of grass, and then printed on the pages is the poem. And the poem was initially published in 1969, and you have a sense here of how it looks once it's standing upright and cross-hatching. I'll just read an excerpt from the poem, which is, I think says a lot without saying a lot. The day is cloudy, the grass is lying flat. It lies low as the ankles, low as the feet. Though it lies flat later than the wind, it rises more quickly than the wind. And though it weeps later than the wind, it laughs more quickly than the wind. The day is cloudy, the grass's roots are lying flat. And could you show the accordion spine? Yes, thanks, Milosh. So this book, as you can imagine, those 2 brown ends, they fold and the whole thing becomes a book. But this is the spine of the book. So you can pull this out, and what this is a timeline of the poet's life. So it's this, almost like this little hidden detail when you turn the book around and look at the back of it, and it fans out like a fan. In the artist's words, Kim Soo-young's poetry represents social concerns while being an example of modern avant-garde poetry. The 48 years during which he lived was a great period of turbulence for the Korean people, who experienced Japanese colonialism, national independence on August 15, 1945, the division of the Korean Peninsula and the Korean War, dictatorships, and the Student Revolution on April 19, 1961. So again, this is a work that it feels very quiet, but it is being absolutely informed by all the social political swirl around it. And that concludes our tour. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to go ahead and drop some links in the chat, some further reading if you're interested. You can take questions.
Hi, we have a couple of Q&A questions. Zoom user asks, I'm interested if you could elaborate a bit on how the technologies of the time available to these artists played a role in their experimentation. Is there a linear history of technologies in typography and typographical images?
Well, this is again just my impression of it. I don't think there's quite a linear progression in this term, because we could see some quite interesting work being done much, much earlier, but there was for sure this kind of idea of experimentation with what the new technologies would allow. And obviously this took a bit of time to settle between these technologies appearing, becoming available en masse, and then people actually starting to experiment with them. But what we can see is that these notions around pushing the limits of what is available that was kind of consistent throughout all of the works we saw. Um, each of these designers, artists, writers looked at what they could do and kind of asked themselves, well, can we do more? And then try doing more and try doing something that's a bit newer, a bit more interesting, which also pushed the existing technology in some way. So I'm not sure that I could say there was a linear progression. I think there was a consistent idea of experimentation that kind of helped use what was available at the time and also push those available technologies beyond their current means. Like, for example, using the spacers to print bits in for the voice, or how typewriters were also used to create these elaborate typewriter poems, right? Christina, I don't know if you want to add something here.
I am not entirely certain of which technologies were available at the time these different pieces were made. I believe the book we looked at first, Mallarmé's book, that was, I believe it was made by letterpress, by setting on letterpress, which I thought that was very funny. The comment in the chat about the printers, like, you know, trying to hide from Apollinaire and Mallarmé, possibly by like, oh my gosh, this is so much work. But I think,
This guy again.
yeah, this guy again, and he's an artist. Um, but I think what's interesting, it almost gives his, like, when we can typeset that now in a very short period of time, and it does not hold the same weight as the investment that an artist had to make in committing to, I want to break the grid. Like, that really required physical labor. Like, letterpress is very physical and it's incredibly time consuming. So I think it's part of the intention of the work, and his commitment to breaking away from semantic meaning.
And then we've got two more questions in the Q&A. So Ludovica asks, in your opinion, what was the impact of these experiments, which we might define as more artistic and literary than design-oriented, on communication design? Beyond the example of Emigre, can you think of any other clear instances of an encounter between concrete poetry and graphic design? We do need a couple of seconds to give this a thought.
Yeah.
I mean, in my mind, these two kind of go hand in hand, to be honest. I don't see, and obviously this is just my opinion, but I don't see concrete poetry as necessarily separate from graphic design because it requires a lot of the same skills, qualities, ways of thinking that graphic design does. Obviously, it does skew a bit more towards the artistic, but there's still a very clear need to communicate a message, which, so I don't know if I would separate them that much. I'd say that they're kind of intertwined, at least in my view of this, and influence each other consistently.
I think, like, in general, like high art and commercial art, they have always influenced each other. It's not exactly concrete poetry, but I'm thinking of, in the, you know, another encounter between concrete poetry and graphic design. I'm thinking of the work of Paula Scher for the Public Theater and how that type like moves and shouts. And I wouldn't say she's not setting poetry, but it does. It harkens back to like letterpress technology, and it does feel, to me, I'm just speculating, it does feel informed by, you know, breaking the grid and having type be expressive and visually say the thing that it's saying in text. I'm sure there's so many more examples. I'm just blanking on other ones.
Yeah, on specific examples for sure, but in general, I think that much like with any experiment, when it was made, it was probably a bit more avant-garde, a bit more out there, but then over time it kind of trickles down, let's say, and we adopt a lot of these ideas in contemporary graphic design without necessarily knowing where they come from. And then we've got any thoughts on the choice of the word concrete in concrete poetry?
That's a good question, actually. Where
It
did that
is.
come from?
I mean, the idea behind using concrete is that it was, rather than being more symbolic or figurative or whatever, and something that we need to interpret, that it would very concretely telling us something by the way it is arranged on the page. Um, I don't have an opinion one way or the other. As I said, we use this, at least I personally use it quite interchangeably with visual poetry. Maybe that's not the best way to do it, but I find the distinction, I don't know, sometimes a bit pedantic. But when talking about concrete poetry, I think the visual aspects of the poemobiles are very close to that. It's this kind of restraint in terms of um, not just visual, but also semantic content. And it's the idea that we're trying to move beyond words as carriers of meaning, but rather having their arrangement on the page. So, as far as that goes, concrete seems apt, but it's not a term I'm particularly attached to personally.
Just reading a couple comments, I think, answering.
It is a fascinating conversation going on in the chat. I just wanted to go through the Q&A so we don't miss any.
Joy says Byrne Porter's work comes to mind, at least with found type and slash language. And then Kay Beal says the term also alludes to the term musique concrète that was in use in the 1940s. So I've never heard of that actually. It's interesting.
And I think actually GS in the chat shared something that we also mention, or maybe another anthology of concrete poetry, or this is Anthology of Concretism. But another quite excellent resource is Concrete Poetry, A Worldview by Mary Ellen Salt, who is also an excellent concrete poet in her own right. So definitely, I think it's on Monoscope as well. So definitely check that out as well. And something we did mention is that that we didn't mention actually is that a lot of these examples we saw were examples made by men, but women have been active in creating concrete poetry since the very beginning of the genre. And on Monoscope, there is another wonderful list of women in concrete poetry, which I think is a must read to really understand the genre.
Stephanie asks, the tradition of the calligram often has a religious context, saying something about the relationship between words and God's creation, for instance. Do you think anything of that idea survives into the modernist and contemporary examples? I think a lot of just literature and fine typography and book production in general had to happen in religious contexts. That's sort of where resources were earlier on across the world, whether in the Quran or in the Bible or Torahs. So I think that, naturally experimentation would happen in that religious context. But I feel like Mallarmé's poem, that feels very spiritual to me. Like it's so infused with grief and loss and thinking, but that's a personal opinion. I don't know that anyone would agree with me and analyze that. It does feel like a lot of concrete poetry, it's coming out of the machine era, right? So that's quite a different perspective. It feels very secular, and it's being informed by war and conflict. But that's an interesting question. If there is work that's spiritual, that is specifically maybe speaking back to like the earliest forms that we saw in religious text.
I think this survives as much as the idea of a religious or spiritual context survives in the time that this was made. So, as Christina said, it's again quite contextual, and we might not know that the specific form comes from that context. But I think, as with any artists, it's going to be very specific to them. Because with calligrams, they were created for usually a specific reason, to illustrate religious texts, but then Apollinaire does them from a very personal perspective. And I think that also needs to be kind of account for whether the religious thought is there. And just wanted to say that in the chat there is a fascinating, well, at least there was, I couldn't see it, but there was a fascinating discussion around white or negative space and its role in art. And I'm kind of sorry I couldn't follow along with the chat because it's very interesting just reading through this. But Zoom user, I think we addressed one of those, but one of the questions. But there's also the question if anybody is familiar with the technology of the printing. I'm assuming this refers to Mallarmé and Apollinaire mostly. I'm honestly not fully sure how they did the typesetting there, and I haven't found any information on this. It would be definitely a fascinating thing to see, especially at that time. I don't know, Christine, if you have a bit more information, because as Colby very nicely says, with all the variety of directions, I can't really imagine what a lockup would look like.
Again, I don't have that knowledge of each piece. One observation just to share, I don't think it's unique to asemic writing, but I thought that was very interesting that Murta Dermisacci's piece is hand lettered, and a really well-known asemic artist that we have in the archive is Timothy Ely, and it's mind-blowing that his made-up language is hand lettered. So clearly, that work was made in the 80s. So clearly, that was a choice to hand letter every last piece of imaginary type. So I think it's just an interesting example of artists may not be using what's available in that moment. They have other choices, other reasons for why they do what they do. It may not be the easiest thing.
And thanks to GS, sorry, that's your name on Zoom, for the links that you dropped in the chat. They're quite interesting and just a very great resource for some further research on concrete poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Giovanni is perfect. Thank you. So any more questions or anything you'd like to discuss? You can use the Q&A or the chat as well. We're looking at both.
I just want to read Jen's comment. I find myself searching the archive to give myself inspiration, especially the ones with interesting type layouts. I'm a student graphic designer working for our school's editorial magazine. We're given complete freedom for our spreads. I always find the poem layouts super useful for inspiration because they truly break the status quo of margin and layout that we tend to see in editorial nowadays. I love being able to see a more in-depth showing of some of these artists as they are so inspiring to me. Thank you for that comment, Jen. And I do feel like there is something about poetry. I mean, we heard it in the words of Joshi and just these multiple pairings between poets and visual artists. There's something about poetry that is just feels inherently wanting to be made visual that I think is really interesting. The form itself like almost invites you to experiment with it, right?
And just reading through the chat, Moses, I'm very envious that you got to study under Joshi. That's absolutely amazing.
Wild, yeah. One of the links I shared in the chat, by the way, is a fantastic article by our fellow docent, Tanya George, on the work of Joshi and his multi-syllabic and multi-typographic life.
And on the Letterform archive, you can also find by Tanya again an excellent article on shaped text. I think it was by Tanya, but there is an excellent article on shaped text, which can kind of give you a bit more pointers on what to look at, what research.
Giovanni, what's your book and what's your last name? I'd love to look it up.
Oh, no way.
No pressure. I'm just curious to see your work. American Letters. Lovely. Thank you.
And Constanza has a question in the Q&A. I have been teaching an experimental layout project in Typography 2 for 10 years. this is the one project where my students get really close to the text, as the design cannot happen without the words. A true pedagogical jewel. That must be amazing teaching this and just seeing all the examples. I wonder if all that there is done on the page in an experimental way constitutes concrete poetry. Um, I mean, my inclination would be to say no, because concrete poetry is still poetry in some way, and there are a couple of let's say parameters around what is considered concrete poetry in general. So maybe the term visual poetry or shaped text is a bit better, but as long as it's poetry and it's laid out on a page a bit differently and forms some coherent image, I think concrete poetry would be quite apt. But again, this is my opinion, and there is so much discussion on this topic. We also have, is there a geographic focus to the collection? Non-European, for example. I'll just assume that you mean the entirety of the archive collection. And the archive strives to have a very broad representation. So across, across eras, across locations, across languages. In the online archive, and I can actually share my screen and show this. Just let me pull up the OA. You can choose which countries you want to restrict your search to, and kind of explore there, but also keep in mind that the online archive has a somewhat restricted number of objects. So in the physical archive, I think there are many, many more available. It's just a selection on the online archive. But just to see how this works, when you actually go to the online archive, if you go to countries, you can actually have a look at all the different countries represented, and filter the objects like this. And then when you choose a specific object, this isn't in the filters, but there should also be the language here. So you can see also languages, and you can filter through those as well. But again, on the online archive, it's just a portion of the archive available.
There are over 100,000 objects in the archive.
And I think the online archive has around 10-ish thousand. No, sorry, online archive has over 100,000, but I still can't keep this straight.
Mm-hmm. There was a question about saving the chat. If anyone would like to save the chat, you click on the three dots at the bottom of the chat screen and click Save Chat, and then you can keep everything that was dropped, all the commentary.
And also, the recording and the chat, I think, will be shared with everyone who registered sometime after the tour.
And just one more note about the geographic focus. I do know that the archive has been very interested in expanding on non-Latin scripts in the collection, particular interest in that. So, and I know as docents, we do also try to show that work as well, like highlight it. Any last questions from anyone? If you are local, also, I really encourage you to take advantage of the research visits. It's free, and you can request to see things in person that you're interested in. It's really fantastic.
And if you can, you should definitely go. I'm kind of envious of everybody who can physically go to the archive, just because it's got so much more content than the OA. The OA already has more than we could go through, but then. So thank you, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure hosting this tour together with Christina. I hope you had a great time, and yeah, hope to see you in some of our next tours.
Anna, did you want to say anything to close us out, or are we all set?
Thank you both, Milos and Christina, so much for hosting this tour. We really appreciate it. Yes, and the video and chat will be sent out later. And thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate it.
And there's just one last question, Sariana. It's Constanza in the chat asking, can you share your email addresses for further contact? Yeah, I mean, happy to. Anna, how do we do this? Would you include them in a follow-up, or do we send them by the chat?
Oh, yeah, if you're comfortable, I could include them in the email, if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm perfectly okay with that.
Awesome.
I'll just drop mine here as well. But perfectly happy to hear from all of you, especially on this subject.
Awesome. Wonderful. I'll go ahead and close the Zoom now, but thank you both again, and thank you everyone for coming to watch. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.